To discuss the important topic are three esteemed Navy witnesses. First, we have Ms. Allison Stiller, performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of Defense, Research, Development, and Acquisition. We also have Vice Admiral William K. Lescher, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations of Integration of Resources and Capabilities, and Lieutenant General Robert S. Walsh, Deputy Commandant of Combat Development and Integration. I want to thank all of you for your service, and just as important, thank you for appearing before this subcommittee on the fiscal year 2018 budget request. Last week, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Richardson, laid out a bold vision for the Navy. He indicated both China and Russia are able to compete on a global scale in all domains and at competitive speed. In response to this increased global pressure, he stated, the future fleet must be timely. We need this more powerful fleet in the 2020s, not the 2040s. Without any reservation, I believe that the CNO is correct. Unfortunately, the fiscal year 2018 budget request does not support the vision of the CNO nor of this subcommittee. While I do not object with the budget's emphasis on current readiness, I believe that there is a high degree of naivete in the area of ship construction. We must start now, not in 2019. Some believe that ship construction is like a spigot that can be turned off and on. I believe that there are those in defense budgeting that advocate for such an approach. In ship construction, though, we know one thing for certain. Ship construction is a long game and requires steady funding to achieve steady progress. Unfortunately, I do not see steady progress towards fulfilling the goal of obtaining a 355-ship Navy. The budget request of only 8 ships does little to build towards a 355-ship Navy. We have hot production lines ready to add more work, but the call to duty has not been sounded. It is time to get serious and match our peer competitors with aggressive ship construction initiatives. As to the specific concerns with the Navy request, building 1 aircraft carrier every 5 years will never allow us to reach 12 aircraft carriers. Building 2 attack submarines a year will result in a submarine reduction in force by 20% in 10 years. And building only 1 LCS will result in massive layoffs at both Marinette and Mobile in the states of Wisconsin and Alabama. These are not acceptable outcomes. As the Marine Corps, I am pleased that this committee has supported, as to the Marine Corps, I am pleased that this committee supported the authorization of 2 more San Antonio-class amphibious ships in the last 2 years. However, I hold some concerns in respect to conducting amphibious operations in a contested environment. As our adversaries become more capable, our Marine Corps may need a bold new vision to accomplish future missions. And I know in speaking with General Walsh that they are well on track to do that in looking at all the opportunities that are out there, using every platform at their avail. But it is our duty to make sure that we find ways to make sure we enable and allow for those visions to be accomplished. This vision may require a change to our legacy forces. Expansion of aviation projection, longer range connectors, and a lighter amphibious capability are all desired attributes of a more capable expeditionary force structure. Unfortunately, I see little of this in the budget request to change our current trajectory. I am reminded of the words of John F. Kennedy himself, a proud Navy officer, when he said that history has taught us that control of the seas means security. Control of the seas can mean peace. Control of the seas can mean victory. The United States must control the seas if it is to protect your security. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time that our nation wake up and seize control of the seas. I would now like to turn to our ranking member, Joe Courtney, for any remarks that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank the 3 distinguished witnesses that are here today to discuss the fiscal year 2018 budget request for the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps. Before we get into the substance of the hearing, I think it's important to remember the context in which we are considering the budget requests submitted yesterday. In December of last year, the Navy under President Obama and Secretary Mavis released an updated force structure assessment that laid out a requirement for increasing the fleet from 308 ships to 355. Among other factors, the FSA noted that increased operations, lengthened deployments and changing conditions around the globe necessitated this boost. Then, in the early days of the Trump administration, the Navy submitted an accelerated fleet plan that, in the words of Acting Navy Secretary Sean Stackley, stated, it offers a first step towards a framework to develop the strategic guidance and identify the investments needed to reinvigorate our naval forces. That plan identified 29 additional ships that the Navy found could be accelerated in support of the larger fleet identified in the FSA. And just last week, the Chief of Naval Operations, John Richardson, released a white paper noting the urgent need to boost the fleet as quickly as possible. As he concludes in the paper, time is of the essence. I agree, and like many of my colleagues on this panel, I have eagerly awaited more details on how the Trump administration would move forward on the highly bipartisan push for a larger and more capable Navy fleet. Unfortunately, the shipbuilding budget released yesterday reflects none of these inputs. Instead, it requests funding for only 8 ships and submarines, the same level as planned by the former Obama administration plan prior to the December FSA, lower than the 11 ships that we just voted on in the 2017 Omnibus Appropriations Act that we passed out of Congress just this last month on a bipartisan basis, and lower than the 12 ships that the Navy identified in its accelerated fleet plan for 2018. In other words, the Trump administration has proposed a 300-ship budget for a 355-ship plan. This proposal really begs the question, what is the administration waiting for? The table was set for this administration to take the work that had been done for years during the prior administration to hit the ground running towards a larger fleet. While I understand the Defense Department is planning a wider review of its defense strategy that will guide future investments, I can think of no element of the department that has as solid a foundation to start from than shipbuilding. A year lost in shipbuilding can never be regained, and unfortunately, that's what this budget proposes. Shipbuilding, as the chairman stated, is a long game that relies on certainty in the Navy's plans and intentions. Nothing in this budget, however, provides any clarity on where this administration intends to go with the buildup of the fleet. There is no 30-year shipbuilding plan that was submitted yesterday, and there was no fit-up. There was no future years defense plan that defense officials so far have just simply named as a placeholder. Congress, industry, and the American people are left guessing as to the way ahead. For some shipyards, this could be a make-or-break issue for them, and we need to tread carefully to ensure that we have a well-rounded industrial base in the future. We have a lot of hard work ahead in the next few weeks to craft our 2018 Defense Authorization Bill in an extremely truncated timeline. I hope that we will use the modest shipbuilding request submitted to us yesterday as a floor and not as a ceiling as we look for ways to further support the Navy's fleet expansion in the industrial base that we will need to support it. That is not to say that there are not elements in this budget that I strongly support. One area of welcome progress is in our undersea forces. In addition to fully funding 2 attack submarines in 2018, as planned in the 2014 multi-year contract, the budget supports a long-sought priority of mine, which is the restoration of a second attack sub in 2021, making sure that the 2-a-year build rate will be all the way through the next block contract, Block 5 contract. That means we can expect at least 10 submarines in that next block, while we look for additional opportunities to increase that rate where the capacity exists to meet the increased fleet requirements of the FSA. In addition to supporting continued development and early production on the Columbia-class SSBN, the budget reflects the Navy's use of key authorities that we've provided through the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. I note that nearly $100 million is allocated in this budget for continuous production of missile tubes and advanced construction activities on the first Columbia-class boomer, the SSBN 826. As we well know, which is where the committee that drafted and created the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, the authorities in the NSBDF have been projected to save hundreds of millions of dollars if fully utilized, and I look forward to hearing more from the Navy about how they intend to use those authorities in 2018 and beyond. I also strongly support the increased focus on restoring readiness and operational availability of our fleet through expanding funding for the ship depot maintenance. This is a topic that Chairman Whitman and I recently publicly discussed in a forum together, and one that is absolutely critical to ensuring that we can fully utilize the fleet we have today as we build towards the future. It appears that the budget intends to leverage capacity in the private yards to support maintenance priorities, as well as focus investment in our shipyard capacity and infrastructure. The backlog in ship availabilities is immense, and we clearly need to do more to address this problem in 2018 and beyond. Finally, so much of what we do in the 2018 budget will depend on how we address the sword of Damocles that's hanging over the entire process, the Budget Control Act caps and the threat of sequestration. Much has been said about lifting the defense sequester at the expense of non-defense spending, such as STEM education and job training funding outside of the Pentagon. I can think of no worse approach for the overall security and well-being of our nation. We cannot expect to embark on the buildup of our ships, aircraft, or other advanced technologies if we are at the same time gutting education, workforce development, skills training, and other efforts at closing the job-skill mismatch that is rampant in defense manufacturing all across the country. The only way we're going to extract ourselves from our current budget quagmire is through a balanced approach that ensures that we meet all the needs of our nation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Thanks for those opening statement words, and it's good to know that I think we're both on the same page about what the course is ahead. So with that, Ms. Stiller, I will go to you for the opening statement that I know that you will present for both the Navy and Marine Corps. Ms. Stiller, if you can either pull the mic closer to you or turn it on, that would be great. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we got to make sure we have it in the microphone because it's.
Okay, I'll start this way.
There we go.
Chairman Whitman, Ranking Member Courtney, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to address the Department of the Navy's acquisition programs. I'm joined this afternoon by Lieutenant General Bob Walsh, Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration, and Vice Admiral Bill Lescher, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Integration of Capabilities and Resources. I request that our written statement be included in the record.
So ordered.
On behalf of our Navy and Marine Corps, we want to thank this subcommittee for your strong support in the FY 2017 Defense Authorization and Appropriations bills. Not only has Congress supported our request, but the committee increased funding for many of our critical programs. We're committed to making good on that investment and to do so in the most fiscally responsible manner possible to provide the ships, aircraft, vehicles, and weapons that are needed for our men and women in uniform to be successful. We've continued to leverage every tool available to drive down cost. We've tightened requirements, maximized competition, capitalized on multi-year and block buy procurements, explored cross-program efficiencies, and attacked our cost of doing business so that more of our resources can be dedicated to warfighting capability. Global activities over the last year have made it clear that security challenges are intensifying at an increasingly rapid pace. To remain competitive, it is imperative that we continuously adapt to the emerging security environment and to do so with a sense of urgency. This requires us to work closely with Congress to return budget stability and predictability to the department, which necessitates increasing defense caps under the Budget Control Act. Our 2018 President's budget submission is governed by SecDef's priorities to improve warfighting readiness by addressing pressing programmatic shortfalls that have accrued from 15 years of wartime operational tempo. The budget maintains the operational effectiveness of our current force while also building a bridge to growing the future force starting in 2019. Over the past year, 11 ships were delivered and an additional 12 ships were christened. One of the ships delivered this year was DDG-1000 USS Zumwalt, a truly transformational platform. And today, CVN-78, Gerald R. Ford, our newest aircraft carrier, is at sea on her acceptance trials. On the aviation side, over this last year, we delivered over 130 manned aircraft and 120 unmanned aircraft. Of note, our P-8A successfully completed flight testing with a capability that will revolutionize air-based anti-submarine warfare. And we designated our carrier-based unmanned tanker as an accelerated acquisition program. On the Marine Corps side, the Amphibious Combat Vehicle Program began delivery of vehicles this spring, with a total of 32 vehicles expected to be delivered by the end of the year. And last month, we conducted a ship-to-shore maneuver exercise which demonstrated new technologies that could shape future amphibious operations. I would like to briefly discuss a couple of items posed by our budget request. First, we've requested multi-year procurement authority for the FY18 to FY22 DDG-51 Flight 3 buy. We have a handshake agreement with Huntington Ingalls to introduce the Flight 3 capability on their FY17 ship. We are also requesting multi-year procurement authority for the FY19 to FY23 Virginia class, which will introduce the Virginia payload module capability. Second, we've made a couple of adjustments to our 5-year shipbuilding plan. We added a Virginia-class submarine in FY21, and we've deferred the start of the frigate program from FY19 to FY20 while we revisit the ship's requirements. Our small surface combatant requirement remains at 52 ships, and we desire to transition to the frigate as soon as possible. However, the administration recognizes the criticality of our industrial base and supports funding a second LCS in FY18. We note that our shipbuilding plan beyond FY18 may be adjusted in our PB19 submission as a result of the Defense Strategic Review that will complete later this summer, consistent with SecDef's FY19 priority to grow a larger and more lethal force. In summary, the Navy's 2018 budget is focused on improving the wholeness of our current forces. We greatly appreciate the subcommittee's strong and consistent support of your sailors and Marines. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Ms. Stiller, thank you. Vice Admiral Lescher, Lieutenant General Walsh, thank you so much for joining us today. Wanted to begin, I'm going to just ask a single question, and I want to go to the ranking member and our other members because we have a long list of members that want to ask questions. So, Lieutenant General Walsh, I want to get your perspective on where the Marine Corps is today. If you look at and hear the assessment of where the Marine Corps is, we look at the force today, and it's a heavier force and a less expeditionary force than it was 20 years ago. And I think in the contested environment that we face, some of the things that the Marine Corps has to do is to look at the weight of amphibious forces, looking at the capability of connectors, making sure we're optimizing that capability, making sure, too, that in all instances we can project power as a highly maneuverable force in a contested environment. I think that those are things that we absolutely have to do today. And I just want to get your perspective on what changes are being made to expand our amphibious connectors and how we're going to be able to project power and what capabilities we will have in a contested environment. And how's the Marine Corps leveraging what I believe for the Marine Corps is a renaissance in aviation capabilities in amphibious operations?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question, the opportunity to talk to you here today, and all the support the committee has done, particularly on LPD 28 and 29 and that support. Great question. And I think, as we look at where we have been focused really for the last 15, 16 years on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this renaissance in, as you called it, aviation has been moving out. And one of the things that the commandant has us focused on is developing a 5th-generation Marine Corps. And as we look at that 5th-generation Marine Corps, there are pieces and places inside the Marine Corps where we're developing that 5th-generation capability. Last year, we conducted really about an 18-month force structure assessment of the entire Marine Corps and looked at where we have gaps and seams, where we're not set up for the future battlefield. As we look at the threats in the future, and the threat drives our concepts and drives our capabilities. The threat we're seeing is not just focused on ISIL, it's not just focused on Taliban, it's focused on peer adversaries and how are we going to operate in that environment. As we looked at that force, the desire to lighten up, as you talk about on our amphibious force, was driven by a lot of the IED threats that we've seen on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's easy to say that we need to lighten up. We can't look like the Army. We're not the Army. We come from the sea. We have to be a light expeditionary force forward deployed. But at the same time, when we get ashore, if it's a contested environment, we're going to have to be able to slug it out and be able to operate against peer adversaries. We do that in a lot of ways as a lighter force with maneuver. So aviation, as you talk about, brings us a lot of maneuver capability. But yet when we maneuver and those Marines go into close contact, they are going to have to be able to fight it out, and hopefully in a maneuver warfare fashion where we're not going tank on tank against large enemy formations. That's not who we are. We're not the Army. So we are looking at exactly what you're talking about. We've done a number of experiments and assessments of how do we lighten up. One of the things the commandant had us do last year was to purchase 144 utility vehicles that can fit inside MRASers, that we're calling them, to fit inside the MV-22, that are expanding our range to be able to go longer distances. While we did that, just at this advanced naval technology experiment that we just did, we were looking at how we can lighten that particular capability and an electric capability that lightens that load to be able to go further. Bringing in network on the move capability. So as we deploy the force and we start to distribute more, we've got to be able to bring the fires with them and the C2 capability, so those distributed forces that can operate in a lighter way have those capabilities bear. So I think we're going after that problem because the number of ships we have is limited. I think we're on a fairly good plan on the amphib side. As you talked about, we've got hotlines. So moving forward, we've got good ships, but we've got to be good partners with the Navy, that we've got to keep in that expeditionary mindset that we've walked away from a little bit in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the focus is on how do we lighten up, but at the same time, when we're buying smaller vehicles in a foot mobile Marine Corps, how do we bring that firepower to bear as we go forward? No question about it that our aviation capability brings us a lot of that. Expanding the connectors, we're looking at that very hard. One of the things we're looking at with Office of Naval Research that we've got a project going on right now is to increase the speed of our current amphibious combat vehicle capability. That's the number one line of effort. The second line of effort is to look at other connectors that could help us in that way. Things like sleds that we could put the amphibious combat vehicles on to move them ashore from further distances and faster, along with different connectors that can help us along those lines, such as joint high-speed vessel, those kind of different connector capabilities we could bring more in faster. And the third line of effort that we've looked at is looking at that problem and how do we get ship to shore in a different way with the technologies that are out there. In this last experiment that Ms. Stiller mentioned out at Camp Pendleton, we had more than 50 different dynamic capabilities that we experimented with that came from across industry and across the naval warfare centers that brought in new capabilities that are going to allow us to be able to sense the battle space, see where the enemy is, where it's not, be able to deceive the enemy, understand that battle space a lot better, and be able to maneuver more quickly ashore. So I think we're getting after this problem pretty hard, and I think if anything, we probably owe some more discussion of this in detail with you in follow-on discussions.
Very good. Thank you, Lieutenant General Walsh. And now go to Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stiller, thank you for noting in your testimony that the budget calls for sort of filling in that 2021 dip in the Virginia-class production and making sure that the Block 5 will be at least 2 a year. You know, even since January, again, we've had combatant commanders testifying before armed services, such as Admiral Harris, again, raising the flag about the need for, you know, addressing the dip, the larger dip in submarine fleet in the 2020s. And Secretary Stackley, in terms of his accelerated fleet plan, had actually suggested a build rate of 3 subs a year in 2022 and 2023, which are, again, part of that Block 5 time span. So I guess the question I would ask you is, would you consider, you know, the 10 subs outlined in the Block 5 to be a starting point in your talks about the next contract? And would your proposal allow for additional submarines to be added beyond the 2-a-year rate, should the capacity in the industry and budget resources become available? And is there anything we can do in our subcommittee in terms of authorities to enable that?
Yes, sir. In the past, we have had the ability in a multi-year contract to also ask for option pricing for additional ships that may not get the full benefit of a multi-year, but obviously benefit from having the multi-year pricing. So we can add that flexibility if we see, as we build our FY19 budget, that additional submarines are going to be added in the later years. As you noted, the FY22 and 23 are the years we are not building a Columbia. So those are years that when we looked at the future fleet plan, we identified as those would be the opportunity, that would be an opportunity to get to the 3 a year. We also need to make sure that we're working closely with industry, both Electric Boat and Huntington Ingalls, to make sure that we understand all of the facilities and manpower required to get to that. But yes, sir, we have the tools in our toolkit to add option pricing on multi-years, which, as we can see, as I pointed out, that one's in FY19 to 23. So we do have a little bit of time as the budget starts to crystallize and we see where we're going to be from a top-line perspective and whether we can get there. And if it looks like we're going to be able to, and it makes sense, we can have a dialogue with the committee to increase the number in the multi-year as well. That's an option.
Thank you. You also talked about the use of continuous production authority on missile tube components for the Columbia class, and also some funding for advanced construction funds on the first submarine, which again were authorities that this subcommittee created in the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. Again, there's a couple other authorities that we had inserted into that portion of the law. And last year was the first year, as you know, that money started flowing through the fund. So it's not just an accounting device. I mean, it's actually a functioning program now. And I was just sort of wondering whether, again, you could sort of elaborate in terms of the department's intentions in terms of utilizing those authorities we gave.
We absolutely intend to utilize the continuous production of missile tube authority as well as the advanced construction. And we continue to look at what other authorities we might need, and we would come back to the committee if we feel like we need additional authorities. This year we don't see that, but we have put into place, as you know, we've been looking across the submarine programs, both Virginia and Columbia, to see where there's synergies there. We've expanded that now to also include looking at the aircraft carriers. So we're looking at our nuclear force to see are there opportunities. We haven't completed all that work yet, and so we may be coming back in a subsequent year seeing that we might find other authorities that would also cross into the aircraft carrier as well, that hopefully would, well, presumably, I'm not going to come back without a business case that's compelling that would drive costs down across the platforms.
Right. Just like shopping at Costco.
Yes, sir.
One last question, which is in your testimony, you stated that the Navy is supporting the Coast Guard's efforts to responsibly and affordably recapitalize the heavy polar icebreaker fleet, and that the Coast Guard expects delivery of the first icebreaker as early as 2023. The President actually was in my district just last week at the Coast Guard Academy and threw his support behind the recapitalization of the icebreaker fleet. I don't, however, see any funding in the Navy's budget for this effort, and the Coast Guard budget seems to allocate only $19 million for the program, which is my understanding is far lower than the levels needed to continue towards advanced procurement and long lead efforts on the first icebreaker. Can you elaborate on how the Navy is working with the Coast Guard to move this program forward, and what can we do in our 2018 bill to support the icebreaker program?
Yes, sir. We have signed two memorandum of agreement with one with the Coast Guard and the Navy, and one at the Navy Department of Homeland Security level. We have put together an integrated program team to run the program with the Coast Guard. We sit on their review boards as the design is going through, and as they've been finalizing requirements and having that debate on cost versus requirements, we're right there at the table trying to provide good suggestions where we've learned lessons in the past. So it's been an excellent exchange. We have Navy folks that are on the team permanently, and then I sit on an oversight board with the Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard. So it's a very good working relationship. As for funding, funding is not included in the Navy's budget because it is the Coast Guard's mission by law to provide icebreaking capability. There is money in their budget. I'm not exactly sure of the amount, but that's to continue these studies that are ongoing. There is $150 million that the Congress appropriated last year of shipbuilding construction Navy money that's available, and as they get into detailed design, that money can be used for detailed design. We can't use SCN money for R&D type of activities. But the Navy doesn't intend to program for the icebreaker. As you know, we have challenges and areas where we want to grow the fleet, and it is more appropriately funded in the Coast Guard budget.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. We'll now go to Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Stiller, thank you for being here today, and I appreciate your announcement and your opening remarks that the administration is changing its request on the LCS program from 1 to 2. I'd like to follow up on that if you don't mind. We all read with great interest the CNO's white paper that highlights that we need to take advantage of our hot production lines, and you know as well as I do how hot the production lines are on LCS. Earlier this month, we heard from Admiral Nagley that the optimal number for the LCS is 3. Now, as far as cost and schedule efficiency, that seems to work pretty well. We're still working towards 52 small surface combatants, including the transition to the frigate, and a 350-ship fleet. Why not continue to leverage this production capacity by going to 3?
Well, yes, sir, and the way we are looking at how we get from the LCS to the frigate while looking at the industrial base, while 3 is the most efficient, I'm looking at it more across the FY17 and FY18. So if you've got 3 ships that were appropriated in 17 and the 2 and 8 that we're talking about to be discussed, obviously, until the 18 budget is passed, that's 5 to go across the 2. Within the yards right now, there are 13 ships that are in phases of construction, and we would certainly work with both shipyards to figure out what's the optimal build strategy during this time where we're trying to transition but keep the industrial base there. So I agree with you, we're not at their most efficient level, but we're also greater than minimum sustaining rate. And so we will work with the yards to make sure that we're mitigating impacts to the industrial base as we move forward.
And I know I don't have to tell you this, but this is a highly trained, highly skilled workforce, and they've been working together long enough now to where they've gotten efficiencies down and costs down, which is music to our ears up here. We want to try to take advantage of that, and I know you and I have talked about this before. This is not a spigot. When we turn even part of that spigot off, all these highly trained people that can get jobs in this economy literally all over the country, they're gone. And trying to rebuild that technical capability at the level we're going to need to build it back to meet your 52 ship requirement is going to be difficult, and I think it's going to draw out your timeline, and I'm pretty sure it's going to increase the expense of the ships in the future. So I know you already know that. I just want to make sure you and I have communicated about that. I want to go to the timing for the transition to the frigate. Now, we went through this 3 years ago. We went through this study that the Navy had from the Small Surface Combatant Task Force, and they called for the transition to the frigate in 2019. Now, obviously, if we can go ahead and transition to 2019, that makes the job of trying to make sure that we've got these hot lines still hot enough and being able to do what we want them to do a lot easier. Have we amended that study to change it from 2019 to 2020?
Sorry, I'm gonna start this, and then I'm gonna defer to Admiral Lescher
Sure.
to talk to you a little bit more about the requirements.
Sure.
But as we have been going through our fleet, as we're watching what's happening around the world, yes, we did have a frigate plan to start in 19. The requirements community has said, no, they want to take another look at that, especially in the local air defense area, and I'll turn it over to Admiral Lescher here in a minute. And so while they're coming through their deliberations, we again will look at making sure that we're keeping that LCS line and the industrial base there so that we can get to the frigate in FY20. But I'll defer to Admiral Lescher on the requirements.
Before you do that, Admiral, you have not amended the plan itself.
I'm sorry, sir. We have moved the frigate start to FY20 in this budget.
But the plan that was put forward in 2014 has not been formally amended.
We are in the process right now of looking at the requirements community is in the process right now of relooking at requirements based on the threat today.
All right.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, Admiral.
No, sir, absolutely. So very briefly, the requirements evaluation team for the frigate is working very hard right now to take a look at the use of the frigate in distributed maritime operations, the distributed lethality concept, which will be a slightly different requirement set for that ship. And so as Allison indicated.
And that's the missile capability?
It's a combination of an aviation warfare capability, increased survivability, and looking at electronic warfare. Concurrent with that, for the OTH missile is something that's part of our cruise missile strategy as well, to bring that on. But that team is working to really present their recommendations in the building end of this month and start briefing that up to the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary.
Let me register one other concern that I have, and that is, and I know this is not something that's set in stone, but there is a figure out there for the cost cap for the frigate at $1.2 billion for a ship that we're making now for about $500 million. That's going to cost more when you go up. We get that. I'm a little concerned that and I know this can change. I understand you may want to talk about lowering that cap. I'm a little afraid that we've got it so high that A, we're really just building another destroyer, and B, this is something we won't be able to afford. So we get it so high that we've designed a program that we're going to come in here and my colleagues are going to say, we can't do that.
Yes, sir. No, I think you're absolutely right. And CNO, in fact, testified this morning before the SACD similarly that figure is too high. That he believes that. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of what is really a placeholder figure in the FY20 column right now, and that cost has to come down.
I want to thank both of you. I look forward to working with you. I know there's a lot of work left for you to do, and we want to be working with you as you go through this. But I certainly appreciate your opening statement and the addition of another LCS, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne, and we will now go to Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all for being here today. As you know, the budget submission contained no FY18 funding for the expeditionary sea-based ESB program, despite the fact that the Navy identified that requirement to double the force from 3 to 6 ships. So could you help us understand a little bit better about what was driving that, the budget, or a change in strategy?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, ma'am. So you're absolutely right in terms of the 2016 force structure assessment called for the increased requirement that you highlighted. What you see in terms of the FY18 budget and the 8 ships that are in there is entirely consistent with the broader direction that the entire Department of Defense has been directed to execute, which is for FY17 really getting after those critical readiness issues, FY18 building on the readiness and addressing pressing shortfalls, and then FY19 is the grow capacity, grow to a larger, more capable, more lethal Navy. And so that's essentially the construct, SecDef Mattis's 3-phase campaign plan to get at the broader capacity, the greater capacity that you highlight.
Are there some current overriding concerns about that, though? And I'm just wondering about the budget in general and what was presented and what your greatest concerns are. Where does this one go, I guess, along with some other ones that
Yeah, ma'am, that's a great question. I think we have to work collectively with the committee and the Navy and broadly to articulate the case, to make the case for the higher defense caps that are going to enable that vision to grow to the larger, more capable, more lethal Navy clearly is not executable at the PB18 funding levels, at the FY18 funding levels. Mm-hmm. And so collectively working to get those defense caps raised is fundamental to getting there.
Yeah. Anybody else want to comment on that? Would you like to comment, Stiller? Deputy Stiller?
I agree with Admiral Lescher. I mean, as he said, the budget, the FY18 budget was really looking at getting our current fleet whole. And as we go into FY19 budget, we're going to be looking at growing the force. But we're going to be faced with, we're going to need to understand how we're going to do that and looking forward to the defense caps to be raised.
Thank you.
I guess just to add, Congresswoman, as we get that ship out there, I think right now, I think a lot of us are looking at, we've had the MLP, the ESB out there, or the ESD. Once we start to see the ESB get out there, I think we'll start getting our hands on that ship and start to see what we're going to be able to use it for as an afloat staging base and how we may use it different. I know the Commandant's very interested in getting the next one into the Mediterranean. And so once I think we start using it out in the fleet and the operating forces, we'll start getting much more comfortable on how we're going to be able to operate with that ship.
You know, if I could add on to that very briefly, before coming to the Pentagon this time, I was a 5th Fleet Expeditionary Strike Group commander, and USS Ponce, the interim afloat forward staging base, was one of my ships. And what the ESB and the afloat forward staging base brings to that theater more broadly is really critical. I mean, those will be very important ships. So as reflected in the force structure assessment, you saw that grew the requirement in recognition of what they bring to the fight.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. If I could just, you'd speak a little bit about the unmanned vessels and what you're predicting, what kind of requirements should we be looking at? And do you plan to incorporate them into the fleet architecture?
I'll take a stab at starting with that. You know, across the unmanned activity more broadly, air and vessels, but specifically to the vessels, absolutely, this is something that you will hear our leadership, the Secretary of the Navy and the CNO, speak very urgently about the need to bring this capability in. So particularly in the unmanned underwater vehicles, you're familiar, there's a family from small to extra large that are executing a set of missions that are key to enabling the power of our submarines more broadly. So we feel a real sense of urgency to get after that, and we could talk perhaps about some of the missions in a closed forum that are particularly compelling. But so we feel a sense to both enable and increase the projection, the power projection of the manned systems. We need to learn about the integration of manned and unmanned. We feel a sense of urgency to get after that. And I would say more broadly in the aviation side, when we talk about MQ-25, it also has a compelling reason to arrest the fatigue life consumption of our Hornets doing that mission. So broadly across all of those unmanned type systems, and to your specific questions in terms of the future fleet architecture and CONOPS, absolutely, it will be leveraging unmanned and artificial intelligence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis. We'll now go to Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your opening statement. If there's a better argument for the need to move aggressively to 355 ships, I've yet to hear it, and I really appreciate you articulating it. I also appreciate, Ms. Stiller, your announcement that you support 2 LCSs this year. I think that's a move in the right direction. I remain concerned, however, I echo Mr. Burns' concerns that 2 ships will have devastating impacts on the shipyards. We went back and forth with the Navy on this a couple weeks ago, and they seemed to suggest that 3 was the minimum required to maintain a hot production line. And so just so I have it clear, you are not disagreeing with the Navy's assessment that 3 is the minimum?
3 is the most efficient to execute within the yards. There is a minimum sustaining rate, which I believe we are well above, but we're somewhere between minimum sustaining and most efficient.
And you talked about
5 across the 2 years, I'm sorry.
No, thank you. You talked about mitigating the impact if you went from 3 to 2. I mean, what would that be? What sort of mitigation?
What we need to look at across both yards is how are they executing? Where are they on their delivery schedules? And how do we more efficiently smooth production? So for example, if it is helpful for them for a delivery date that we have in a current contract to extend that so that they can more succinctly level load the workforce in the yard, we're more than happy to have those discussions.
It's just, I mean, both yards, as you know, have been optimized for 2 ships on a 6-month production rate. So I worry when we get into mitigation production rates that really what we're admitting is that, I mean, if 2 of our yards, 2 of the 7 are having difficulties, I don't see any way where we can get to 355 ships and thereby satisfy the Commander-in-Chief's intent. And kind of in line with what the chairman laid out, echoing the CNO's white paper on the need to get there in 10 years, not 20 years or 30 years. Does the Navy have a plan, or is it part of the ongoing review? I know we're talking in 30-year terms, but is anyone thinking about how we get there in 8 years or 10 years?
As was referenced earlier, Mr. Stackley signed out the accelerated fleet plan, which, as he talked about it helps to set the framework for strategic guidance. We expect that to be part of the discussion as SecDef goes through the strategic review, and we get through this summer to figure out where we're headed. But where you're going to see growth in the force, as Admiral Lescher mentioned, is starting in FY19.
The other thing,
go ahead.
if I may, sir, add to that. You know, the Navy is looking very comprehensively to your point about how you could really accelerate growing to a larger force. So clearly the initial steps, the investments in this budget to improve readiness to get the ships we have out is one element of that. Looking at service life extensions as well, where that makes sense across either DDGs or SSNs. Also commissioned a study to look at whether recommissioning would make sense, and then also, of course, looking at new build. So that is part of an ongoing comprehensive assessment. that would be really rolled out as part of the next year's budget about how you get after this in the most aggressive way.
So when is the soonest we and the American people could see a Navy plan for getting to 355 in the 2020s, as the CNO says we must? To include what mix of ships go to what shipyards and just how we do it.
Well, no, again, sir, it's a great question. One, of course, key element of such a strategy would be how fiscally informed it was. And so it starts with the ability to execute that, to make that plan come alive, obviously starts with the defense caps as well. And so I do think that that's part of this ongoing discussion that will come this summer, this fall, and certainly be part of the FY19 rollout.
Well, I just would hope that we talk about strategically what's necessary before we get into fiscally what we need to achieve, what we know we must, right? And so if we have that clear signal coming from the Pentagon and from the Navy, it makes it easier for us here to make the argument to our colleagues that we need to fully fund what you're asking for. Because 355, as I remember, is the minimum you guys are saying you need to satisfy ongoing requirements. So the sooner we can get there, the better. And so, and I just would submit that, I mean, if you look at how the Reagan administration got there, they were able to do both at the same time. I appreciate the crucial investments in readiness, but the fact that we are actually taking a backward step when it comes to shipbuilding is incredibly troubling. And so I just would ask that you work with us on how we do this in a more expeditious fashion, and I hope we get to see that plan. And as the CNO said, you know, we believe the Defense Industrial Base could produce 14 more small surface combatants in the near term and a total of 29 more ships over the next 7 years than under current plans. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. We'll now go to Ms. Bordallo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. While I share some of the concerns that my colleagues are voicing about resource allocation in the FY18 Navy budget proposal, I am pleased to see an effort to rebuild the readiness. And I will first note that I was pleased that the request included 3 MQ-4C Triton systems, which provide a critical maritime ISR capability at a crucial time in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. Where I understand an early operational deployment to Guam is scheduled for 2018. Admiral Lescher, could you tell us how things are going on the program and whether the deployment is currently on track?
So, ma'am, I'll have to get back to you on that specific deployment, but I'll tell you the program is to a point where it's going to be able to execute. It looks like the acquisition profile that you highlighted of 3 this year and 3 going forward. So we're very much looking to bring the multi-int capability of that aircraft online. Forecast for an IOC 2021 timeframe as well. So anything else you would add, Allison?
Can I ask you to get back to us when you do have some plans on about the deployment? Okay, and shifting subjects, Assistant Secretary Stiller, it's nice to see you again. And could you discuss how you see that this budget request adequately addresses the current threats that hold our forces at risk? Are we investing appropriately in long-range standoff weapons?
Ma'am, I'll start off and then I'll turn to Admiral Lescher as well. But we do have a strategy for our weapons across the board, and we are investing in each of the areas, and we look at it in the near term, the midterm, and the far term. We've been very careful to make sure that we're putting a balance across investing today, investing in the near term, and also investing in the long term to understand exactly where we need to go. So I don't know if you want to add to that, Bill.
Yeah,
Admiral?
Just a little bit more detail. So as Allison said, in the near term, we're really focused on providing options to the commander in terms of how these weapons are launched, these long-term weapons, and also their target set. So, for example, the Tomahawk, with the request for a 100 in this budget, which is an increase from the prior budget. Obviously, that's ship sub-launched for a land attack mission. The LRASM also forecast with an early operational capability on the B-1 in FY18 and an F-18 in FY19. So that's an air-launched weapon, providing the commander options to get after the maritime target set. SM-6, maritime target for cruiser-destroyer type ships. So those would kind of be the set for the near-term 2020. As we move into the 2020 to 2025 range time frame, the Tomahawks, as you know, will be coming in for recertification starting in FY19. As part of that recert, we'll to build built some of them as maritime strike Tomahawk variants. So from ships and submarines to be able to strike both land and maritime targets will be an important flexibility for the commander. In the 2020 to 2025 timeframe as well, we're investing in an advanced harpoon for an aviation launch to go after the maritime target. And then the OTH missile we talked about earlier as part of the distributed lethality, to look for that to come aboard LCS and frigates. So a little bit of an outline.
Thank you, thank you. One quick question also for you, Secretary Stiller. Are we coming up with any kind of final plans? I've asked this before at hearings about putting together a dry dock. We now have the appropriations available in the Western Asia Pacific area. Do you have any plans? I understand it's in a planning stage, but where are we?
So, ma'am, I would certainly like to come and sit down with your team and talk about what's the best use of the $9.5 million that you refer to for depot level capability. But as you know, that Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Secretary Stackley and Secretary McGinn ask us to do a business case analysis on having dry dock capability in Guam, as well as a warfighting analysis.
Or any of the other?
Right, and as they came through, and we've done both of those, and our warfighting assessment tells us that in peacetime and in wartime, the repair timeline would be too long for that to be of value. But we went ahead and looked at the business case too. And the business case, because of the throughput in the dock, it just doesn't make fiscal sense. So I want to figure out the best way that we can leverage those dollars. And we are in the early stages of coming up with ideas, but it'd be worth sitting down with your team.
Well, I'm
figure out
concerned
the
because of threats.
Sure.
You know, we certainly have been threatened in our area. And in this case, I certainly think it would be important to come up with some kind of a plan. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bordallo. We'll now go to Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Stiller, we were in my office with Secretary Stackley, and we created the integrated program office, right, for the icebreakers. We now give the Coast Guard, as of my Coast Guard bill today, we gave them total block buy authority for all their major acquisitions. They can lead materials, trying to put them on par with the Navy. So I guess Mr. Courtney already talked icebreakers. I guess the one specific question I have is, do you think it's even possible to build 3 to 6 heavy icebreakers in the next decade without doing block buy? The Navy does block buy on lead ships, and again, the icebreaker, there's ice, the icebreaker hits it, goes down on it, backs up, hits it, goes down on it, backs up. I mean, it really is not rocket science, but the Coast Guard will make it seem as such if the Navy allows them to.
Sir, I would tell you that block buy authority has certainly helped us in certain acquisitions. We haven't always gone to it on a lead ship, but certainly on follow ships. You just have to weigh the risk, to your point. So as they come through the requirements, I think as we can look at the risk, we can make a really good assessment whether block buy makes sense. But certainly when you're buying a limited quantity like you're talking about, whether it's 3, even 6. If it's 6, perhaps you'd start the block buy from 2 to 6. But if you're talking about 3, you just have to look at the risk. But absolutely, block buy helps with the vendor base, the commitment to the shipyard, all the way around. It's a very helpful tool, and it would be very useful for them, I'm sure, to be able to most efficiently.
Which you're telling them, I would presume.
Oh yes, sir. We're right at this stage of the game, when what we're doing with the Coast Guard is really looking more at the requirements and the trade-offs to get the specifications right, working with industry to get their good ideas as we go in and build a contract design type package so that it can go out for bid. And then as we get closer to how are we going to go contract for it, we will certainly have those discussions.
How do you see at this point the Coast Guard getting the $1 billion to do that?
Sir,
without using Navy money?
Sir, I defer to the Department of Homeland Security and the Coast Guard on that. Like I said, we signed an MOA at the Navy DHS level just last week, and really that squares away how we would go about contracting depending on the color of money. But they understand that that's not coming from the Navy budget, that it's coming, that they are going to have to address it. So,
okay. Last question is, what's nice about coming in late is everybody asks your questions before you do, so I don't have to say anything. But Ms. Davis from San Diego asked about the ESBs. So, but here's my question in general. One thing I don't understand: if you've got hot production, right, and you stop it, You guys have, you and Secretary Stackley have obviously looked at the cost incurred on stopping a hot line. I just don't, I don't understand how we're going to take a timeout for FY18, do all maintenance and repair, add no new ships, and even stop the ones that we requested in the last 6 months, for instance, like the ESB. I don't understand how that plays out across the shipyards in the country. When you stop a hot line, then you say, okay, you got to fire all the welders, all the pipe fitters, all the guys bending steel, and then we're going to rehire them back in 12 months. Just explain to me how that works. I don't get it.
Well, sir, in the case of NASCO, who's the builder of the ESB, they also have work in the yard that's Navy and commercial work. So as you know, we ran a limited competition for the LHA 8 and up to 6, or including 6 oilers, and we ran a competition of dissimilar ships, the TAO, and NASCO has run the TAO. So they have steady production in the yard for the oiler. They also have commercial work. ESB 5 was an FY16 appropriated ship and authorized, and thank you for that help. But they have not yet started construction on that ship. So we really have to look at what does the workload look like in a yard. It's a little different than, because they are more of a multi-product yard. So they have a workforce that has a base of work. And so we would have to look at the best timing if we were to go ahead and buy additional ESBs that are called out in the FSA.
So I'm out of time in 20 seconds.
Okay.
So tell me non-parochially,
Okay.
across the whole country, when you look at shipyards and you're stopping a lot of these builds with no new starts going for 1 year, what does that do nationally to some of these yards that aren't NASCO?
Sir, we do not like to go to 0 and then restart. That is not where we want to be, and that's why we look at how can we make sure that we're paying attention to the industrial base. Mr. Courtney would be able to tell you that in submarines we had a hiatus of 6 years between submarine builds. That was very difficult at the end of the Seawolf program to ramping back up into the Virginia class. So we are very aware of the devastating impacts that can happen if you go to 0 in a yard or near 0. So we look very carefully with the yards. We have dialogue with the yards to make sure that we're not doing that type of harm. We have gotten to minimum sustaining rates in a number of yards and on a number of aircraft and weapons programs, and that's difficult because you end up paying more for what you have to go buy to equip the warfighter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. We'll now go to Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Stiller, I understand and I got to see the benefits of the block program, and I think we will all agree that the one product that's built that's on budget and sometimes comes in under budget is like the Virginia class. And the Virginia class, it's the method by which it is built, but in addition to that, it is where we did the block program. Having said that, however, Admiral Richardson's white paper says the Navy must get to work now to both build more ships and to think forward, innovate as we go. To remain competitive, we must start today and we must improve faster. A great philosophy. But my question is, how do you determine what? In other words, and when, where? So all of this is premised on the threat, and his paper focuses on Russia and China, understood. But in his paper, he also says China was a land issue, and then decided in 2015 or something along those lines that all of a sudden they said, well, you know what, we got to be a maritime force, and they can switch immediately and do whatever they're going to do, which I assume that if we are reacting to that threat, that we are going to have to reposition ourselves to whatever they decide that they need to do to be a maritime force. So how do we make that decision? Our problem is we really set our policies by acquisition. What we do is we say, okay, it's going to be Virginia-class subs, and if we do a block program, it's 10, right? At some point, it may not be the answer, though, of course, I will never admit that, or I will never believe that, but say something like that happens. How do we anticipate that? When I was in Congress before, LCSs all of a sudden became the bad thing. We weren't going to build LCSs. I come back to Congress, and we're building LCSs again. Oh, yes, there's some modification. We may call it a frigate. We may do whatever, but we're building it again. So how do we plan for that effectively and efficiently and within the costs that we have to always look at to contain and to manage?
So ma'am, I would say on most of our programs, most of our weapons, our platforms, our shipbuilding platforms, they're very adaptable. And so over time, we've been able to pace the threat. And I'll give you an example. I'll use DDG 51 and then I'll use Virginia. So on the DDG 51 program, we've got 64 ships delivered into the Navy.
And we were supposed to stop DDG 51.
We did stop. We did stop.
Right.
There's an example of where
Right.
we shut the line down and then we restarted it, and we're in the restart now. But we also are introducing our air and missile defense radar to that ship. In fact, I mentioned that we have a handshake today with Ingalls to introduce that on their FY17 ship. So going forward in the 18 multi-year, we're going to introduce that capability, which will give us much more enhanced B&B capability on those ships. So we have also done that on Virginia class. As we've seen the threat evolve, we've been able to pace the threat, whether it be in the combat systems or Virginia payload module, for
Right.
example. So we build platforms that are very adaptable. And so what we need to do a better job of with CNO, where I think CNO is going to, is the ability to inject those changes more rapidly, get the capability developed, and be able to get it out there quicker. He and I have co-chaired a couple of accelerated acquisition boards. We've designated 2 programs to be Maritime Accelerated Capability Offices, MQ25, and our LDUUV. And we also have an RPED project for Surface Navy Laser Weapon Program. So he and I are looking at how do you tailor and make sure that you can get programs off and running to a good start. And we also have the ability to prototype, to go test capability, fail in some cases, I'm sure, but in other cases we'll be able to be successful and be able to get stuff to the fleet faster. I don't know if you wanted to add.
Ma'am, if I would just add, the theme that Secretary Stiller has been talking about of increased agility, and to your point, to be able to not just be reactive, but to be proactive in the way we acquire things is a key theme that you will hear continually from CNO and the Secretary. The sense of urgency to be able to just be more agile in developing and fielding fleet. This framework of focusing on not just platforms, but the payloads and the sensors, and really it's the netted integrated things that we're investing in that we see as the really the game changers for the tactical capability we field.
And I'm running out of time, but what I would like to have you respond to is, in terms of our laws and in terms of the way procurement works, what is it that you need, if anything, for that flexibility so that you can change what is there? And if you could, I'm out of time, but if you could give it to me back in the record, because it seems like that's what's missing. In order for us to do it, you've got to be able to be flexible.
Yes.
And is our structure sufficient in terms of that
Yes,
flexibility?
ma'am, and I'd be happy to give you that. One of the first starts was the 16 NDAA, which pushes stuff to the services, so.
Thank you.
Ms. Hanabusa, if you'd like, we can have the question answered now if you'd like.
Oh, is that, oh, thank
Yes,
you.
Yes.
Could you please answer it?
I will, but I can also get you additional. We've been working very, very closely with the committee on acquisition reform initiatives that would help us to streamline. Giving us accelerated acquisition authority has been very helpful, so we can go and tailor programs, again, like I mentioned, CNO and I are trying to do, and we want to become the norm. The FY16 National Defense NDAA pushed oversight to the services, and that is very helpful as well for programs that are not joint programs, so to give services a little more flexibility. We have particular legislative proposals that I can get you a listing of things that will help us. But we have been working very closely with the committee, and I think we have a lot of good tools in our toolkit. We just have to give them some runtime now because we've recently gotten them. I don't know if you had it.
If I could jump in on that, Allison. One thing I think is the law is really helping us out. It is pushing things down much more to the service chiefs, but within our large bureaucracy that we've got within DOD to work through that. Now, how does that big bureaucracy adjust to the flexibility that you're giving us?
That's exactly the problem.
So as we are getting into the details of that, one of the big things that is challenging us is, so where does the money come from? Typically in the past where we've taken money is out of existing programs and squeezed those program lines, the R&D out of those programs to try new ideas, new innovative things to kind of move faster. So as we now start to take in our programming process and align money to that, that's not what we've been used to in a normal DoD way of acquisition. So by moving money into that area, do I move a little in? Do I try it? Is somebody going to take it from me if I move it in there? You know, up the chain of command, is somebody over on the appropriator side going to take the money if I move it in there to try? So I think the key thing that we're starting to see is be very specific in the area that we're trying to do innovative ideas, and then work very closely with our chain of command all the way up through DoD and then over here on Congress. So when we say, hey, we're going to put money in here against this capability area, it might be mine warfare, it might be ship-to-shore maneuver, and we put money in there to do some rapid prototyping to see where we get, that money doesn't disappear as we put it in there before it gets appropriated.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hanabusa. We'll now go to Mr. Garamendi.
I want to follow up on what Ms. Hanabusa was working on, but start in a slightly different place. We've heard discussion, or after discussion, about a 355-ship Navy. And it almost seems to me that that number is driving decisions. And the LCS is where I want to go with this. Ms. Hanabusa said it started, it stopped, it started up again, and the information that we have currently available is that it doesn't work for what it was designed for or developed for. But yet we're going to continue to build them. And since it doesn't work, we're going to go build a frigate. And now we don't know what the frigate's going to be used for. We had a discussion, Admiral, a moment ago. It's going to be electronic warfare, or maybe missiles, or maybe whatever. And I'm trying to figure out, what are we doing here? Are we simply trying to build ships to meet a target number? Are we trying to build ships, or are we building ships for specific purposes? The discussion a moment ago about flexibility, I assume that was flexibility, that the ship might be used for this or that and different elements added to it. Presumably that's what the LCS was supposed to do, but doesn't seem to do that because it can easily be sunk and doesn't work close to shore because it can easily be sunk. I don't get it. I really don't understand. I understand why we want to keep the shipyards busy. Very cogent argument, Ms. Schurler, that you put together on that account, as did Mr. Byrne, and Mr. Gallagher. I guess it's the appropriate time for me to raise the issue since they're both gone. But I don't get it. I don't understand here what it is. And we're talking about, you know, $500 million a copy or more. So help me. Help me, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here with these particular ships?
So I would start by observing that the fleet has a very high demand for these ships, which is, so it's contrary to the notion that they're not working. They're in fact, Admiral Roden, the Surface Forces Commander, said, hey, I need these ships out here and I need more of them. In terms of the specific missions in particular that the littoral combat ship will be executing, one of the key ones is mine countermeasures. So our current mine countermeasure ships, the MCM-1 Avengers, are running out of service life. And they will be retired in the late 19s, early 20s. And so that mission will be executed by LCS. It also has surface warfare and ASW warfare mission packages as well that will execute. I would say one of the more compelling ways to think about LCS.
Excuse me for a moment for interrupting.
Yes, sir.
The Director of Operational Test and Evaluation says that the mine countermeasure and the anti-surface warfare mission packages has not demonstrated, don't work, has not demonstrated effective capability.
Right, and so they're
so
in
what did you just tell me?
They're in development right now.
Tell me they do or they don't?
Well, like any sophisticated technology, and what's compelling about this technology as well is it takes the man out of the minefield, right? So we're talking unmanned technology with a forecast initial capability of that MCM mission package of 2021. So we've absolutely work to be done to mature that, to get that functional.
But these things are not survivable in the area for which they were intended to operate.
Well, so as the commander who is going to use them. We'll take a look at, he will design his operation and design his campaign so they are survivable, right?
In other words, not putting them where they were intended to operate.
Well, I think they will operate as intended. But what they also do is, if absent these ships, we would be putting, you know, $1.5 billion DDGs to do some of these missions that are not suitable for those ships. So these ships are designed specifically to replace the MCM ships, to replace the PC ships, to do that mission in an environment in which they were designed to do.
But not survivable.
Sir,
Is
sir,
that the case?
sir, that
We hear
there's-
over, I
there's
hear
a- there
over
are
and
different
over again.
components to survivability. And that when the requirements for these ships were laid out, they're incredibly fast, so they can get in and out of an area, and
They
that,
don't go very far.
well, sir, they can go far. I mean, there is the iron triangle of, but I understand what you're saying. They were designed to a certain level of survivability. That has been enhanced over the time in the program. And again, these ships were designed to be, have mission modules that would switch in and switch out, as Admiral Lescher was describing. And so they really are single mission ships. And as Secretary of Defense Hagel and Secretary of Defense Carter and Secretary of Defense Mattis have said, we want to get to a frigate that's a multi-mission that will have the SUW and the ASW capability inherent in the ship. So there is absolutely a mission for these ships, as Admiral Lescher said, for the LCSs. They're in demand today, and they're in construction today, and there is a demand for the frigate going forward with a total inventory of 52. And so we're trying to figure out what the right balance between the LCS and the frigate should be.
And you're not yet complete with that analysis.
Well, as we were intending to go to the frigate in 19, we would have had a total of 28 LCSs. In order for the industrial base, there'll be additional ones. They will be employed. We're looking at backfitting capability that we're intending for the frigate onto existing LCS and be able to do that in forward fit as well.
There are many more questions. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Vice Admiral Lescher, just as a follow-up, in the shock trial testing for LCS, give us a perspective there about its survivability based on its testing standards.
Sir, I think I'll ask Secretary Stiller to speak to this as well, but it performed well, is the bottom line there. So do you have any more?
Yes, sir. Both variants went through shock trials this past year, and they both performed very well. And DOT&E was part of that analysis, so they were with us on the ship. They were tested to the survivability levels that they were designed to, and they passed.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing today. So when it comes to transitioning technology, I believe that we have to be prepared in advance to facilitate smooth transition from the lab into the joint battle space. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So in that line of thinking, we can't let our desire to get to 100% deter us from fielding a 95% solution. And if we delay funding transition pieces, then we risk technologies falling into the valley of death. And I understand that the Navy has decided not to fund the transition of railgun this fiscal year, despite multi-shot with inspection tests having recently occurred and a true multi-shot test likely to take place soon. So I want to know, what is the potential impact to railgun development without this transition money?
Sure. So the status of railgun is there's continued S&T funding, as I think you just highlighted in this budget forward, and that really just reflects the technology maturity of it right now. So going to the 6.4 funding that you were talking about for demonstration and validation in an operationally realistic environment, our assessment is that technology is just not ready for that stage yet. So we're continuing to fund it, looking for the repeated, 10 rounds per minute type capability out of that weapon and the barrel life as well. Continuing to fund that to keep the overall momentum going. We're also refocusing fundings into the hypervelocity projectile and accelerating that for use in the 5-inch powder guns so that we can integrate it with the combat systems. So in that specific program, the current profile simply reflects its execution and the maturity of that technology right now as we continue to try and develop it and take it forward.
So at what point in its development would the Navy find railgun viable in order to consider transition?
Sir, I think, as you mentioned, we have a multi-shot event coming up later this summer that will help us to look at it and see where we want to go and as part of the 19 budget. But that gives us additional information that helps us to retire some of the risk.
Yeah, I think for FY19 is when we're forecasting a full-scale prototype demonstration.
Okay, and as we look forward, what platforms does the Navy see as viable for railgun?
So I'm not sure that analysis has been done yet, or it's been settled yet. I'll take that for the record, sir, and get back to you.
Okay, I would appreciate it. I just don't want us to, let the enemy, the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, I commend the Navy for being very forward-leaning on things like directed energy. I know we've got a test weapon on the USS Ponce. It's a 30-kilowatt system, and again, not perfect. It's not where we want to be in terms of a 150-kilowatt system, but we're learning as we're going, and it is effective against some targets like drones and things like that. So we're learning a lot. So again, I commend the Navy for being forward-leaning on directed energy. I just don't want us to see us fall behind and lose the opportunity to get railgun out there as well, and if we're waiting for perfect. Ms. Stiller, our shipyards, and particularly those working on our submarine fleet, depend on timely distribution of funds from the U.S. Navy in order to successfully procure and construct the various pieces and parts of our fleet so that they can deliver on time and under budget. The Navy has previously predicted the long lead time material engineering support and advanced construction activities required to capitalize on advanced procurement successes. Has there or will there be coordination with the shipbuilding industry to identify what delays on delivery or additional costs may occur if we don't have adequate advanced procurement funding?
Yes, sir. We are in constant communication with the shipyards, and for our next multi-year on Virginia, we've already identified EOQ funding that will start in FY19 for that multi-year, and in concert with the shipyard to make sure that we're getting the best deals we can with our EOQ funding, and that will go through the entirety of the multi-year. But we want to make sure that we have it up front when we need it. And I think we have it adequately funded right now in the budget. But we'll continue to have that dialogue with the yards, and if they identify other areas where we could benefit from EOQ, we're happy to have that discussion.
I think that dialogue is important. That makes me sure that that continues. Finally, you may have to answer this one with record. My time's about to run out, but the Navy has made great strides in the Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program. The existing fleet has been receiving enhanced electronic warfare and surveillance capability. So leveraging these technologies is essential to pace the impending full-spectrum threat of tomorrow's fight. How does the FY18 budget request advance electronic warfare capabilities? And also, the Marines have also planned to grow their electronic warfare capabilities through aviation and ground EW equipment. Will the FY18 budget request provide the Marines with adequate funding to make further investments in the spectrum realm?
Thank you, Congressman. I mentioned earlier we had gone through a fairly detailed force structure review. One of the areas that we focused on very heavily was information warfare, of which electronic warfare is a big piece of that. So what we're doing in our Marine Corps Force 2025 is growing that structure in electronic warfare, and in the FY18 budget, we've got funding going into both aviation and ground programs to increase those capabilities, along with the R&D efforts to get more follow-on enhanced capabilities through some of the labs that we have.
Sir, on the CWIP question you had, the FY18 budget has Block 2 in full rate production, and Block 3 initial system, it's in development. Contract award is forecast for the fourth quarter of this year.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Now you're back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. Ms. Stiller, I do want to end with one additional question that hadn't gotten mentioned through the line of questioning, and that is concerning the aircraft carrier build. As you know, in the force structure assessment, the projection was there to go to 12 aircraft carriers. And I want to get your perspective at the current build rate of one carrier every 5 years. Is it possible to ever get to 12 aircraft carriers, building one for every 5 years? And if not, what would the cadence of construction need to be in order for us to get to 12 within the next 30 years? And did the budget request include anything in that initiative?
Sir, we could have gotten to 12 carriers for a brief period of time had we, when CVN 79 was introduced, but we changed the delivery schedule on that ship so that we would not get above 11. So if you stay on 5-year centers, right now we're at 11, you'd eventually get down to 10. So we've always said where you need to be to get to a 12-carrier Navy is about a 3.5-year centers. And we are not there right now. We are on 5-year centers, and at this point, the budget doesn't reflect anything that would change that. That will be something as we go through the Defense Strategic Review this summer and SecDef's priorities for the 19 and out budget that we'll be looking at.
So if we were to go to a 3.5-year cadence in builds, we could get to 12 in the next 30 years.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Very good. Now go to Ms. Bordallo.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Chairman, I'm returning here for another question because I want to straighten out the record. Secretary Stiller, when I asked you about the dry dock, you said one of the reasons that they're still discussing it is it's not financially viable. The BCA says that it is twice as expensive to not have a dry dock than to have one on Guam. And of course, this would certainly be the case if you had to depend on other U.S. shipyards. I'm wondering, would the Navy be going back to relying on foreign ship repairs like they did in the old days, taking their MSC ships over to Singapore? So it is my belief, and Navy leadership has stated, and we have this on record, that a dry dock is a strategic need in the Western Pacific. And I'm concerned again, and I want to repeat it, that there is an over-reliance, or maybe there is an over-reliance on foreign ship repair. So I'm asking, what's wrong with Buy America?
Yes, ma'am. As you know, MSC ships are not home ported, although, and I know that's a nuance there. But when we looked at the BCA revealed to us that the usage rate would be too low to justify the cost for the dry dock and the infrastructure that came with it. The estimate in that BCA was anywhere from $32 million to $46 million a year to maintain the dock. And so that just far outweighed.
So where would you go for ship repair then?
You can come back to the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And that's not expensive.
There is an expense, but it's not as expensive as maintaining a dry dock.
Well, I think this should be further looked into, and, you know, I plan to do this because
Understand.
I just think that if anything should erupt in our part of the world, and Guam is in the lap of North Korea, so I want to see that we have everything we need, and that's a full-scale dry dock on Guam. And the money is there, and so I see no reason why we can't continue to look at this very seriously. So, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bordallo. Now go to Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question, which is kind of a nagging one that my office certainly hears a lot about from Groton, which is the issue of security clearances. Again, as the hiring up is proceeding, I think actually, and I think Rob's probably in the same position, you know, the state of Virginia and Connecticut, they've been doing a pretty good job of, you know, getting training and you know, workforce skills in place with the help of the Department of Labor. But the security clearances, I mean, they've actually reached a point where they're segregating parts of the yard to, you know, because they're still sort of in limbo, waiting for the final. Is this an issue that you're watching, and is there anything that you can help us with in terms of reporting back?
Yes, sir. I can tell you that this has been high on the Navy's concern list, and I believe it was last week. He may not have signed it yet, so don't hold me to this, but Mr. Stackley was poised to sign a letter to the Defense Security Services folks offering to provide naval reservists to help get at least the interim secret for the shipyard workers so that they can go and start work. Obviously, to get to the clearance level has to go all the way to OPM. But this would at least alleviate the backlog within the Department of Defense. We're looking at this as a one-time thing, but we want, so that they can go address it. But we really do understand the impacts of not being able to get that workforce employed where we need them. And so we are looking at doing this on a one-time exception to be able to go and address this backlog.
Well, I'm glad I asked the question. And again, if there's a...
Of course, if you can help us with OPM, that would be wonderful.
And we're there, I mean,
Yeah.
all in. And to the extent that, again, that, memorandum has been released, again, I know my office, and I would imagine others would be very anxious to get a copy of it.
Yes, sir.
And lastly, Mr. Chairman, just for the record, I just feel like, given the discussions that both of us had earlier, I'd like to enter into the record the executive summary of the FSA, the February 9th accelerated fleet plan, and also Admiral Richardson's memo from last week. Again, I think it just to help sort of complete the record.
I would agree. So ordered. We'll make sure we do that.
And with that, I'll yield.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Cordy. I do want to, Ms. Stiller, also address one other thing, and that is the Ready Reserve Force. In looking at today where the demand is in relation to potential conflict and our ability to sustain logistics surrounding a major war, I believe we're going to be severely tested with the current element of our Ready Reserve Force. It's antiquated. Its ability to conduct extensive logistical efforts, I think, is really going to be tested. So the question is the Navy looking at the Ready Reserve Force? Is there anything in the current budget request to look at building the Ready Reserve Force with the capability necessary to be able to sustain logistical support necessary in a major conflict?
So this is something that we will be addressing in FY19, but we have been looking at it, and in fact, in the Navy's accelerated fleet plan, there's a little section that talks about looking at our pre-positioning ships and the age of those, and that those while not aged out are aging, and they could go. And it doesn't say it exactly like this, but that those ships could be considered to go into the Ready Reserve to relieve those ships that are very old, because what we don't want to do is build brand new ships and then put them in the Ready Reserve. That doesn't make sense. So you would recapitalize potentially the maritime pre-positioning ships, and we want to look, because we want to be very thoughtful about it, we want to look at something like a common hull form or a family of common hulls that would provide that capability, that would provide synergy on and logistics support and other stuff. So we are looking at it. Transcom's also interested, as I know you've heard, on bringing ships from the Maritime Security Program, buying them and bringing them into the Ready Reserve. There is probably a mixture of all of that has to be looked at. And again, we intend to be looking at that in 19, so I think you'll start to see that discussion happen starting in 19.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and we would like to continue the discussion with you and see a concrete proposal for 19. I think we have to do more than just look at it at that particular point. Hopefully what we look at over the next year, that we can work with you to have a concrete proposal in 19 for the Ready Reserve Force, because my concern in talking with General McDew and others is that our capacity there and ability to sustain in a major conflict is really being stretched to the point where I think it becomes strategically problematic.
Yes, sir. We will work with you.
Very good. Thank you so much. Any other questions from the subcommittee? If not, we are adjourned.